So I just want to start with a quick story about my first indication that the system of capitalism was broken and that it really matters who writes the rules. About 6 years ago, I was working in a set of communities in Central America that were fighting against a mining project in their community, as well as in the indigenous state they lived in, about 33 hydroelectric dams. And numerous communities were going to be flooded out of their lands. People were laying their lives on the line, blockading roads, being shot at by the government forces, saying we need a say in what our development looks like, and this is not in our interests, and this does not respect the way that we want our future to look. At the same time that it was 100% legal for the national government, without respecting indigenous authorities, at that time, they did get some changes to the laws, to authorize a mine or a dam to come into the indigenous state and exploit those resources in whatever way the government approved of. The government was also levying fines on community members for cutting down a tree in a river's watershed to build their house out of wood. So, this is clearly incredibly backwards. As I kind of kept going and working with different groups of people that were advocating for public health around Central America, I also encountered a garment factory that had shut down after the Central American Free Trade Agreement was passed, laid off 1,400 workers, I believe. And a couple hundred of those workers actually got together and said, we're gonna restart this factory as a living wage factory, worker owned. And that factory is still struggling to become profitable. They've been operating for a number of years, and part of the problem is that they're competing with actual slave labor on a global level. So it became very clear to me that the important, incredible fights that people were waging on a daily battle to create small local solutions were hitting some major structural challenges. One of the solutions that has been proposed in the face of a very broken system of capitalism that is oppressing people, as its definition, has been fair trade as a business model, so kind of a capitalist response to the problem. And fair trade has really provided some real solutions. It's showed that you can have a business that respects workers. You can have a business that takes into account the environment, that looks at the entire chain, that divides power amongst all of the workers. But the fair trade as a label has also externalized the costs of checking to make sure that everything is good all the way down the chain to the consumer, which often makes fair trade completely inaccessible for people who don't have higher economic means. And it's also led to a proliferation of labels, some of which are greenwashing, some of which are blue washing, which makes it, as someone who works with people trying to tease apart what's actually going on with your products, incredibly difficult. Not to mention, again, we're asking people to pay more, so it's kind of like that factory that is a living wage, so you can have a roof over your head, you can afford to feed your children, and you could maybe even send them to school, and you can afford basic health care, and that's competing with slave labor. So where our bar is set is not gonna work for people, and it puts them at an automatic disadvantage. So Staunton Lind, who's a historian and also has worked as a lawyer with workers' groups for decades and decades, has been through a number of different movements, when he looks back at the transition from feudalism to the current system that we have now, he looked at hundreds of years of experiments and local work building up parallel institutions. So different small bubbles that were creating power, that were creating alternative ways of organizing. And a lot of what we look at with the Washington Fair Trade Coalition is how do we create space for those experiments, for those, for all that work that we're building to continue. And some of these are new experiments, some of these are very old systems that have existed for a long time. But what does it look like to hold space for community-held property? NAFTA, which was passed in the mid-1990s, actually struck out of the Mexican Constitution the hard-fought right of indigenous people in Mexico to communally own property, which is what sparked the Zapatista uprising. So how do you protect the ability of local groups to create requirements for green jobs, or to have local hiring requirements, or to build local food economies and support those, when we're building things into our trade policy that make that illegal and put them at risk? And not just them, other countries can levy sanctions against other areas and really turn different groups against each other. What do you say when we're trying to protect the rights of people to have a local say in building their future, and what that looks like when a community in El Salvador can say, we don't want a gold mine here because of the health and water contamination that we've documented, and there can be a lawsuit levied against them under an international trade agreement, and not against them, against the government, so then we get arm twisting and all sorts of internal politics, because that hurt the gold mining companies' expected anticipated profits. So what we are really fighting for is really a level playing field, a playing field that allows these local building of power, local building of different options and opportunities and ways of organizing ourselves, and also a fight for the imagination. Because if you can't imagine other ways of structuring society, how in God's name are you going to build it? And if you have never seen a worker-owned garment factory, how can you imagine building something like that? If you've never, I was shocked to learn when a documentary on the women's liberation movement came out that at one point we had actually passed a law for universal childcare in the United States, which was vetoed by Nixon. And this blew my mind, that was almost a reality. If you've never seen an example of direct democracy, for example, the way that the Zapatista communities are organized, a completely different way of having a political process that is based on the town hall, community, and community, like actually representing your community, having to go back and get permission. Or if you've never imagined what like a community-owned school looks like. So really, when we're talking about building alternative systems of power and building local solutions, what does it look like on a global level to create space for that? And I don't know if by the time we have made all the changes necessary for that, it will still be called capitalism. But it's not a surprise to me that the current trade policy we have, which is one of the biggest institutions of sort of setting the global playing field, does the exact opposite. Because when you have a company like Monsanto deciding what fair regulations of pesticides are, when you have the oil companies saying it's arbitrary to deny a permit for the Keystone XL pipeline because you've approved other pipelines and we want to sue you for damages, and also that all of the arguments you have for vetoing this, including climate change, indigenous rights, farmer rights, the will of millions of people who have been organizing, are not valid, because a pipeline is a pipeline is a pipeline, and you're only allowed to take into account the process. If you have trade policy that the big ag has a huge role in negotiating, is it surprising that we get rules like a raspberry is a raspberry is a raspberry? It doesn't matter what happened to the workers along that process, and it doesn't matter what happened. And at what point is something like supporting a boycott of berries that are based in wage theft and slave labor and sexual abuse actually become illegal on an international level? So I think that I don't know about the answer to the can capitalism be fixed, I think you'll all figure out in the next 20 or 30 minutes, but I do think it's important to think about, as we build space for those solutions, what it looks like to fight to keep that space open on a global level. So.